Very happy to have you all here for the third edition of Sediment Stories, which is a series of discussions that we're hosting at Veditum. I'll begin by taking a couple of minutes to introduce you to Veditum and the projects that we have, and then we'll move on to today's chat. Um, Veditam is a not-for-profit organization, and we are working to transform environmental governance in India. We are working to empower communities to be able to take action and to create empathetic environmental leaders for the future. How we do it is a long story, but we have two flagship projects, Moving Upstream and India Sandwatch. As part of Moving Upstream, we've been walking along rivers for the past 8 years in India, documenting them, learning about them, writing about them. And the one thing that we learned from all of those walks was that all of our rivers, or almost all of our rivers, face this real challenge of illegal and unsustainable sand mining. From that learning, we created the India Sandwatch project, which is a project that is looking at the sand mining sector in India, right from the governance aspect of it, but till where the material is extracted and taken to market. And there's an open data project at its heart, which is allowing public documentation for the first time of this sector, enabling the creation of evidence to generate accountability. And parallelly, we are doing a bunch of activities to sort of finally go to that same vision of having sediments and secured in our ecosystems. Sediment Stories is one such effort where we are talking to various people who are understanding sediments, learning about sediments in their own ways at different parts of the life cycle of sediments, right? From when it's created to when it's extracted and it's being used. Today we have with us Anuja Mital. I'll put Anuja on the screen with me and introduce you to Anuja first. And then Anuja and I will have a conversation, and we'd love to have you participate in this conversation, ask questions, right? So Anuja is a herpetologist and freshwater ecologist from Mumbai, and she's the co-founder of Freshwater Turtles and Tortoises of India, an organization that works towards the conservation of freshwater chelonians and their habitats through collaborative research and community action. She's working towards being an interdisciplinary researcher, dabbling between river ecology, freshwater turtle conservation, nature education, and outreach. And she's also running a community science project. She's currently a PhD student in integrative conservation at the Odum School of Ecology, University of Georgia. And her research focuses on understanding the ecology of large rivers by studying the adaptations of local communities and soft-shell turtles to floods across the Brahmaputra. Very excited to hear from Anuja about uh, whatever her learnings have been, how she's seeing adaptations play out. And today we'll specifically be talking about the shifting sands in the Brahmaputra River and turtles and communities. Welcome, Anuja.
Hi, Siddharth. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to Veditum for hosting me.
Yeah, we're excited to be hosting you here today. Um, yeah, so shall we dive headfirst into the discussion?
Yeah, sounds good.
Great. All right. So the first thing that we want to kick this off with, also before we do that, just to tell everybody who's here, the flow of today's event is that we'll do a Q&A with Anuja, and we'll get to hear from her. You're putting your questions in the chat. After we do this Q&A for about 30-40 minutes, we'll then start answering your questions. Yeah. So with that, the first question, Anuja, if you can talk to us about the role of sediments in rivers and how river islands are formed. And
Yeah.
maybe you can start with that.
Yeah. So, I mean, when you go to the Ganga or the Brahmaputra, the first thing that you see, if you try to see the opposite bank, a lot of times you think that, oh, that's the other side of the river, but oftentimes it's not. It's actually a sand island and maybe one of many that's in between. And then there's several sand islands, and then you have the other end of the river bank. So I think India is really blessed with a multitude of rivers and across all grading intensities and across all sizes and widths. And I have been fortunate to work along the Ganga and Brahmaputra and smaller tributaries. So seeing smaller to bigger rivers and understanding how, just the where a river is situated, that itself impacts the sediment load, and then that impacts the width, the depth, the presence of sand islands, etc. in the river. So speaking specifically about the Brahmaputra, because I've been working on the Brahmaputra for the past 5 years, it's a highly braided river with multiple channels. So because the river has such a high sediment load, because it's downstream of all the rivers from the eastern Himalayas kind of flow and all merge and enter into the Brahmaputra, the sediment load is quite high. But not just that, the Brahmaputra bed load itself is quite high. So when you have a very high braiding intensity, that there's multiple channels, many braids being formed, and then the slope incline of the floodplain, a lot of the geomorphology of the bedrock, the floodplain itself, all of this, and then the impact of the high rainfall and the flooding, annual floods that happens every year, all of this kind of contributes to, formation of these large sand islands, which I'll further refer to as chors or chaporis, as they are in commonly called in West Bengal, Bangladesh, and Assam. So yeah, when we have a lot of this sediment, high sediment rates, a lot of these bed forms are formed, and you have these river islands. Whereas when you go to smaller rivers like maybe Ganga, or I'm calling Ganga a smaller river, but Ganga or its tributaries like Hagra, Sarju, you will see a lot of sandbars. So sandbars or point bars or mid-channel bars are these smaller depositions of sediments before and after the floods that occur, which are also again very important, but their life cycle is relatively short. So when you have continuous sedimentation on these kind of sandbars, point bars, and the high bed load contributing as well, that's when over time you have these huge sand islands and chars that are. So I can also go a little bit on talking about classifications of chars. So kind of what I'm looking into right now is how we kind of can classify chars based on like GIS and from field surveys, but also from talking to people and seeing how they are classifying chars. So usually chars are classified on their shapes. So they can be elliptical, triangular, rhomboid, or just irregular. And a lot of times people also then classify them based on their permanence. So if they've been permanent for 10 years, we've seen chars that are 40, 60 years have been stable, or semi-permanent that are less than 10 years, and completely temporary, which, can get washed away. And then again, based on whether they can get washed away or are flooded, whether they're chronically flooded and the entire island is covered, whether they're occasionally covered, or if they're just flood free. And then based on, a lot of times people also are more interested on whether there's high silt deposition or high sand deposition. So all sand islands or sediment basically is alluvium, which is a composition of sand, silt, and clay, and in different proportions. An interesting bit about these sand islands is there's a lot of silt usually, and there's a lot of humus layer as well. So that's why you instantaneous, because the organic matter is also quite decent, they are quite fertile, and it's really a perfect area for grasses, shrubs, riparian vegetation to grow really quickly, as well as agricultural crops as well. So people are also kind of, then interested in seeing whether a sand island has more silt deposition or more sand deposition as well. So there's a whole bunch of criteria based on which, chars are classified in different river systems.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Uh, I was also, I think you do have slides or photographs to
Oh, yeah.
So I think it'll be great for some of us who may not be familiar with what islands look like, what these chars look like. So to also show and say, okay, this is what this kind of char looks like. Maybe we can do that.
Yeah, I completely forgot I had photos.
Yeah.
So I always like this photo of the Brahmaputra is really great. It's by Dhritimar Mukherjee, who is a famous photographer. So you can clearly see that there's a lot of channels, there's a lot of braids, and you can of course see the main channel, and then you can see how the tributaries are coming down from the Himalayas and also entering. Of course, this photo is during the flood wet season. So a lot of sand islands are of course submerged, but you kind of get an idea of how sediment rich this whole river is and how massive this whole floodplain area is as well. So here also, these are pretty much like the ones that have full grown trees. You can clearly make out that these sand islands have been stable for like at least 30, 40 years plus. And then the smaller sandbars or smaller sand islands can be of different shapes, and they, have very temporary life cycles. Another interesting thing is when you look at the shape of like a sand island, usually when it's the upstream part of the sand island is more raised and it has a gentle slope as it's more downstream, and you'll see more ripples and contouring towards the downstream end. So that's always pretty cool. Sometimes when you're walking on a sand island and you kind of get lost and have no idea of direction, that kind of really helps when you can see that okay, it's tapering off this way, then yeah, well, going towards this side. Yeah.
Wow, that's super cool to know. I think it's a survival
Yes.
skill as well, I guess. If you're ever on a sand
Yeah.
island. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, the humus, the organic, the silt, everything is so rich on these sand islands that within like few weeks itself, a lot of these grasses, especially in Assam, the cast grass, they instantly, take over and grow really quickly between flood cycles. So you will have even the smallest of sandbars that within a month or two can grow these grasses, tall grasses and reeds really, really, really quickly. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow, this is incredible. I mean, I never get tired of seeing cars full anywhere.
Class.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. It adds a little bit of green when you're like in a sea of blue. So it's always pretty.
Yeah.
But
So
yeah. And then, oh yes, the erosions of char. So usually erosion also is a very complex process. I'm still, reading up and trying to figure out exactly why certain islands are more prone to erosion, but it definitely obviously has to do with the geomorphology of the floodplain and also just the current, the hydraulic activity of the current and the flow of the river. So usually, if you have lateral erosion on one side of the river, um, it all of that sediment has to go somewhere. So you will end up having depositions on usually on the other side, either as a sandbar or as a chapori on the other side or downstream eventually. And this is kind of cool because you can see as the flood waters recede, you can kind of see that this island, even though is quite stable, does have constant process of erosion as the water levels keep dipping because the current and the flow, the hydraulic activity is really strong.
yeah, yeah. So there's, you talked about the semi-permanence, permanence. There's like a whole variation of
Yeah.
these islands almost being ephemeral. So how do communities who live in these parts, how do they engage with these islands? How do they say it? You talked about they classifying it based upon use, but
Yeah.
can you speak a bit more about how communities make use of these islands and how they see it?
Yeah. So actually this whole uh like when I came to work on the Brahmaputra, I knew that there were sand islands and that people lived on them, but hadn't given it much thought till I think I have a photos. Yeah. This was the one of the first few photos I clicked. I was doing surveys in Orang National Park and we reached one sand island. And I could see that in the next sand island there were like it was like clearly a village, and then beyond that as well you could see on the next sand island also there's a bunch of houses. And so then I started talking to the forest staff and the other people and started learning more about this, and that's how kind of my whole interest in doing this PhD happened because prior to my PhD, I did not have any sociological or anthropological training. But every turtle research work that I did, it always, of course, because rivers in India are immensely human dense and human populated. So you always come across people, and I always work closely with fishermen or river dependent communities. But this was something that was kind of just struck a chord with me, where I was just really fascinated and wanted to know about how these people, these different communities go about living their lives. So just to talk about Assam specifically, it's really diverse. You have multiple different communities that live on the sand islands with different migration histories. So you will have Assamese people, but you'll also have different tribal communities like the Missings or the Boros. You'll specifically in central Assam, you'll also have Nepali pastoralists that came, even prior to the British. You'll have a lot of Bihari peasants and fishermen, and then, of course, Bangladeshi Hindus, Muslims, or Bengali Hindu Muslims that have settled for many generations. So all of these communities have come for either different reasons, and a lot of them have told me that either the land was really cheap because it chronically floods, and that's why they were able to get this land, or they are mostly landless migrants. And people who have been associated with farming for a long time seem to have a better idea or know how to manage these floods. So even when a new char comes up, it is usually immediately farmed on if possible. And a lot of times it's the community together that kind of farms smaller islands. As the islands are bigger, they're kind of government property, and then it's a whole tricky business going into the whole revenue system and settling of these lands to peoples with pattas and all of that. But in general, a lot of chars that do become stable are either leased by people or are, farmed upon, because people do have a good sense of when an island has become permanent based on cues of erosion, sedimentation, vegetation, um, the way the water undercurrents, the swirling of water around islands. So all of these are certain cues by which people kind of know. And only when an island has been really, really stable is when kind of we do see settlements on them. Otherwise, if they do get flooded, people just, farm on them or do other livelihood activities, and they might just build like a kuti. So like if there are pastoralists that take their livestock for grazing, they will take their livestock there and just build like either a rest house or a small kuti for the buffaloes or the cows or whatever. Yeah, so it's been really fascinating to kind of look at how different communities firstly have different vulnerabilities based on the floods, and which areas of chars or chaporis are more susceptible to flooding, and what makes people stay there. And then, of course, how are they adapting to it? So we do see a lot of people now migrating out because it's just not feasible. But a lot of people have kind of resigned to the say that this is the natural regime of the river. It floods annually. So they have a bunch of adaptations, whether they'll build changhars out, their entire houses raised, or inside of their houses raised, or during the flood season they leave their house and temporarily for 3-4 months go to a settled area. Some people now prefer to have farming on chars, but then also will have a backup farming area on a river bank or in a settled area, just in case it gets washed away. And even I've spoken to people who very poetically say that we can see that our land is going by next year, or in 2 years it'll probably go, but in the next 10 years it'll come back again. So time cycles or timelines for certain communities are so different. Like we get anxiety thinking about what we're gonna do in the next 10 years. Here, their entire life and property is getting washed away. But there is I can't say sense of reassurance or resilience, but it's just they've resigned to the fact that it'll come back again and they'll be able to go on with their lives.
Yeah, I guess it would be more poetic if their lives weren't dependent on it, but the
True.
dependence makes it a bit heartbreaking. But speaking
Yeah.
of time scales and 10 years, 15 years, or even how memory might have passed down between generations on how to adapt to different kinds of river islands, why don't we
Yeah.
talk about another category of residents of these islands, which is turtles, and which
Yes.
is something that you've studied. So, can you talk
Yeah.
about turtles and their sort of uh, presence on these islands? How do they use these islands? What's their
Yeah.
relationship with these islands? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very, very close relationship because, and turtles, even though primarily are aquatic, they are also a kind of bridges between the aquatic and terrestrial. A lot of people don't realize that they do require a terrestrial environment for many of their life history functions. So, um, can like it's very difficult to spot the soft shell here, but it's right in the corner on the right.
Ah,
So all turtle surveys usually for me have always been by the riverside and scanning either the other river bank, because when turtles come up to bask on sand is the best time to, note them, note the occurrence, note the time. We get a lot of life history information, the habitat ecology of the species, etc. So what we've seen, even though I haven't done a specific habitat ecology study, but there are many studies worldwide which show that a lot of turtle species, especially hard shells that really bask communally, prefer and need these sandbanks or mid-channel bars for basking. And soft shells especially are kind of sensitive. And there are certain species even in India, like the Chitra indica, which is very similar in habitat requirements to the gharial. They prefer kind of these pristine sandbanks, not just for basking, but also for nesting. And we've seen there's anecdotal evidence. Again, nesting ecology studies have not really been done in India, but from anecdotal evidence, we know that different species have different nesting requirements. So almost all of them, of course, will nest near the river. But where the water line is, whether it's loamy soil, whether it's open canopy, the amount of grass percentage, the amount of shrubs, all of that really kind of makes a difference to turtles. So see on this sandbar again, we see a softshell turtle on the right, and we see a lot of puncturas, the roof turtles basking. This is in the Brahmaputra. So these sandbars will get flooded and are temporary. So even the permanent sandbars are really important during the wet season for basking requirements of turtles. And basking is really important for thermoregulation and also development of eggs and just general overall health of the turtles. So these sand islands are integral part of the life history of turtles.
wow. I love this photograph, and the gas pool, of course, is grabbing a lot of my attention, but the number of turtles is just
Yeah.
quite something.
I don't have a zoom lens. I'm more of a field, never been a photographer. These are the best I can manage, but
Good.
uh, yeah, so I usually end up getting photos like these, but
The-
this also is just a barely emerging sandbar, and we see that a soft shell turtle is basking. So these sediments and these temporary sand islands are also really really important for soft shell turtles. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. No, that's great. Okay, there's an echo. Yeah. Um, right. So, we talked about the turtles and their habitats, and I've always been curious, and I just wanted to understand, how do turtles manage when there's floods in the Brahmaputra or in any
Yeah.
other river? Because it seems like such strong currents. Then how do turtles manage in something like that?
Yeah. So again, we a lot of us we don't know the movement ecology of these turtles. We really don't know what they do in the floods. I can only venture a guess. But softshell turtles are very very good swimmers. They're even equally fast on land as well. Don't like underestimate how fast they are on land. But they are really good swimmers. So I think that they've evolved to kind of deal with the currents, but of course, during the floodplains, we do see that during the wet season and during the floods, we do see a large number of occurrence or reportings or sightings or rescues of turtles in the floodplain region. So specifically talking about the Brahmaputra, also in now July, August, September, we'll start getting calls, of turtles venturing into people's backyards and agricultural areas or in their pupuris, in their backyard ponds. So we still don't know, and there are the Brahmaputra itself has many other wetlands and smaller rivers and tributaries where also people have cited them more during the wet season. So the idea, I guess, is that they do kind of have these diurnal patterns where, meaning in the year, uh, movement patterns according to the wet season and dry season, where in the dry season, they come back to the main channel of the Brahmaputra, and then these kind of sandbars are really important and where we see them basking.
Right. Yeah. That's quite fascinating, and which makes me think that for this kind of a movement to be enabled or for it to happen, there seems to be a need for continuity or connectivity across the floodplains and even beyond the floodplains. So,
Yeah.
do we have that kind of connectivity, and what are the kind of things which are not allowing this behavior to continue? So, in a way, trying to ask
Yeah.
threats that these flood islands might have, or the sediments
Yeah.
itself in the river. What are the kind of things that you can maybe highlight for us?
Yeah. So, so usually whenever we do surveys for turtles on these sand islands, it's not just turtles, right? We come across a lot of other wildlife signs. And being in Assam specifically, or when I work close to protected areas, tiger pug marks, we had sightings of, jackals on the sand islands, innumerable amount of birds and bird nesting on these sand islands, even elephant marks on these islands as well. So otters, so many otters make dens as well. So it's not just turtles, a lot of terrestrial wildlife or mammals as well kind of use these river islands or sand islands as corridors and or as refuges as well. So I think they're really important, and I don't think there has been enough attention to this yet, especially now in Assam. We see that the Kaziranga Wildlife Sanctuary is expanding, and they're declaring more and more parts of the Brahmaputra as protected. But we are not seeing, maybe in due course of time, but we're not seeing that kind of protection or attention given to these islands, and studying what kind of wildlife or the migration or movement patterns that these animals or turtles or other wildlife are doing across on these river corridors. I'm not aware of any other riverine corridor as well that's really protected. In the Ganga for aquatic wildlife, also specifically, we had the Varanasi Turtle Wildlife Sanctuary, and then we have the Vikramshila Dolphin Sanctuary. But again, they're very linear demarcations of a river that is flowing continuously, and you have upstream, downstream. So it's very difficult to regulate, these kind of protected areas or build these kinds of networks. So it's entire landscapes that will have to be looked at, especially in the river and then the floodplain area as well. So it's going to need an integrated approach, and also there's immense human pressure. Humans live there, earn their livelihoods, and that's something that cannot be overlooked at all. So a lot of times people will end up losing their livelihoods if you declare a river corridor as protected, and kind of ban fishing, ban river bed agriculture, which is the sole earning livelihood of people. So there has to be a very interdisciplinary or integrated approach when we look at these riverine corridors especially.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's so crucial given
Yeah.
how many people rely on this.
Sorry, I was just checking what was the next photo. But yeah, like when we do surveys on these sand islands, this was the hatchling of a very critically endangered, the Chitra turtle that, again, I mentioned is very close, like similar in habitat requirements to the Gharial. And we found it in a small pool on a sand island. So it didn't even occur to me that okay, maybe these sand islands are also refuges for hatchlings and juveniles, which might not do well in the main river as well. So that was like a very interesting find for us. And then of course when we do surveys, we also like, you can clearly make out that this is a really huge soft shell turtle from the tracks that came and passed. So usually that's then how we kind of figure out, okay, that these are certain areas where there's a healthy turtle population, or if we see presence of hatchlings, then we know that, okay, this sandbar is possibly a nesting island. Sand island is a nesting island.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's just fascinating to learn about how all these different animals are using these islands. But if I can go back to the question regarding
Yeah.
the threats that these islands or sandbars face, can you speak a little
Mm.
towards that?
So it's been really disheartening because sand mining has been one of the biggest threats that I've seen, especially on the Ganga, not so much in the Brahmaputra, but in the Ganga, it was quite rampant to see it throughout our entire journey, especially in UP, some parts of very small parts of Jharkhand as well. Um, and yeah, because when you're sand mining, you're firstly just completely destroying the riverbed and the riverbank barrier, and you're making the area very volatile in already a flood prone area, especially in down eastern UP and Bihar as well. That's where the Ganga floods uh, very, very frequently. And so there are reports of hundreds of trucks going out a day. So all of that sediment being taken out of the river really impacts the downstream creation of a lot of sand islands, again, that are important for many, many species. Another thing, and then of course, there is this, let's skip this, sand mining. This is something we saw in UP. And this was in Jharkhand actually. And then a lot of because of sand mining, then as I mentioned, the risk of flooding also you're making these areas very fragile, this riverbanks very fragile. And then another threat that I do see is that, a concretization of riverbanks. Um, in the upper parts of UP especially, they're trying to make it like Sabarmati, where the Namami Gange program has given a lot of funds for even small villages, the riverbanks, to kind of really be made into pakka cement ghats. A lot of cremation ghats that used to just be on the sand on the riverbank are now kind of being concretized, and that again uh, makes it difficult then for turtles and other aquatic wildlife to bask, gharials as well. They absolutely are losing on their basking and nesting grounds because of this. And this is actually the Assi River in Varanasi, which has been completely made into a channel. And that's actually the confluence of the Assi River into the Ganga as well. So that also then increases the amount of sewage and sediment in inorganic sediment flow, organic and inorganic sediment flow that's just increasing into the river, because you're kind of channelizing all of the other tributaries and rivers that are kind of entering into the. And another threat is, of course, the building of terminals, and not just ghats, but terminals for ferries and the waterways. Because if ships kind of need to ply, the river depth kind of needs to be quite high. So Varanasi is a example that I'm giving because I did some work there, and there was a multimodal terminal that was being built very close to Varanasi. So on the right, you can kind of see we did a bathymetric mapping where the river depth at Varanasi is actually close to 10 to 13 meters deep. And that bank is very, very geologically stable. And you can see like a massive sand bar over there that has not changed for hundreds and hundreds of years. There's been no erosion or extra sedimentation. It's remained quite stable. But upstream and downstream of it are many that all of that sediment load upstream and downstream, the islands, sand islands and sandbars are constantly in flux. So the turtles and skimmers and terns and dolphins, all of these are going to get affected if you have extra boat traffic, extra tourist pressure, ferries, load bearing ships going through these areas. And if they're constantly going to be dredged as well, dolphins are pretty much going to absolutely go extinct from that area as well.
I mean, that's a very interesting point that you mentioned regarding the river, the sand deposit opposite the Ghats of Banaras, because for something that's over 100 years old, just about 3-4 years ago, they actually dredged a path right through that sand deposit for the waterways project. And it's been very problematic to see how they've awarded clearances and they've made it easy for clearances to be given for waterways projects, and threat around sediments with that. And I just want to use this opportunity to say that the next session of Sediment Stories, which will be in July, the first weekend of July, we'll be talking to Avli Verma from Manthan Adhyayan Kendra, who actually works on waterways full time. So she can talk to us a lot more, taking from what you've said, and talk about how the waterways plays with sediments in the Indian river ecosystem. Yeah. So you want to continue on this point more, or shall we move?
Yeah, like, so this, just a little, like, one more example. This is an island that's downstream of where the multimodal terminal has now come up, of the Varanasi Turtle Sanctuary. So you can see buffaloes grazing on an island in the distance. You can see skimmers nesting, which there are very few, like less than 10 to 15 skimmer nesting beaches in areas in India. And then you can also see a bunch of river terns also nesting there. And then in the foreground of the picture, you see riverbed agriculture where people are growing tomatoes. All of this is now gone. It's all been dredged in the last 5 years. So that is kind of a huge threat where, dredging and also sand mining, all of this is absolutely, you're messing with the natural flow and the ecological regime of the river. And we are going to have consequences of that.
I mean, it's truly heartbreaking. I mean, I've walked the Ganga and I've seen the kind of population pressure that there is right of the river, and to see that we're increasing anthropogenic activity through different ways on the rivers and the pressure it's exerting. Yeah. So
like, this is a lovely picture of coexistence where humans and wildlife, it was all great. And then when you have extra infrastructure development, it's all gone for a toss. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, this is important. So we'll segue into the questions. I think we have a couple of questions, but before that, to wrap this up, or so that there is something as a takeaway as well. One is, if somebody is interested in this, how do they start to understand this more? What is the lens that they should wear while looking at ecosystems like these, which are very dynamic? And second, related to that, is what can we really do to address these kind of threats?
Yeah, well, if someone's interested, I mean, if you are able to always try to assist with people working along rivers, try to spend time outdoors and near rivers, and it will really, you learn a lot. And also definitely work or talk to communities that are river dependent or live along the rivers. I have learned almost everything I know about turtles, honestly, from fishermen across the Ganga. So don't underestimate how much people know, and how much be completely open and willing to just learning from people, because they spend all of their time by the river. So I've definitely learned a lot from conversations with people. In terms of what can be done, so I think definitely these same river dependent communities, if we can have more like programs with them or conversations or participatory workshops with them, where they also are able to understand, the whole role of the watershed, the whole role of the river, the ecological roles. And it may be very naive, but that may be how things change. Like in Arunachal, um, there were CCAs, community conserved areas, formed in Zemithang, and there was a lot of work that NGOs did with the youth there. And the youth themselves have been able to stop sand mining of the rivers in those areas. Again, the way sand mining operates in UP Bihar is you can't compare it at all. But my way when it comes to either even turtle subsistence hunting or any other threat is to kind of just try to work at a really ground level and then empower the communities or make them active stakeholders so that they can themselves affect change, and also really work with young kids. I feel like by making sure that the next generation kind of knows, all of these issues, that just, solves our problem for the next 10, 20 years if we really try to work with school children. But then also, I mean, as the problem of sand mining is so complex, the work that India Sandwatch and Veditum doing is really great because you're crowdfunding, these instances of it's a citizen science initiative. You have these data sprints. So you have all of this data coming in from the public, and that kind of creates kind of a buffer from, facing dangerous or other legal actions against people. Yeah, so there's a lot people can do.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much also for highlighting the work of India Sandwatch. In fact, if there are ecologists or researchers watching this or field workers are watching this, I'll just take this opportunity to say that if you observe sand mining activity anywhere, uh, you can email the observation to us to add to the growing repository. Like Anuja said, sometimes this can be challenging and you can have a fear for your own life, etc. So if you have observations of mining activity, feel free to send it to us. We will anonymously then add it to the overall repository that is helping us understand this. We'll put a link to Sandwatch in the chat. We'll send it to you over email as well. And if you're watching this later, it'll be in the description of the video, right? So we'll move to Q&A now, Anuja. Before
Yeah.
we move, and we already have a lot of questions, the a reminder to everybody who's watching, if you have questions, please keep putting in the chat. We are keep making a note of these and we'll serially ask the questions. Yeah. So the first question is from Urvashi, who asks, have you noticed any climate change impacts on the formation of sand islands and or the species relying on these islands?
Okay. I specifically haven't, but I'll just talk about what I've been going through recently through my research is the qualitative interviews I've been doing with communities that live on these islands, stars, chakoris, and a lot of them do say that the flooding intensity has increased. There's a lot of mini sudden flash floods that also happens, which used to not really happen before. And that can kind of really only be explained by changes in weather patterns because of climate change. Also, a lot of deforestation that's happening upstream and unprecedented or infrequent rainfall that's happening upstream or in the Himalayas. That also really affects the sediment load. So people are saying that there's a lot more sand deposition instead of silt. And if sand completely comes on their island, you can't farm wheat, maize, all the valuable crops. They have to either farm watermelon or peanut. Those are the only two things you can farm when there's sand or debris that come on your sand island. And that is also happening more frequently. That is also because of anthropogenic activity, but then also because of unseasonal rainfall and flash floods happening upstream. Um, Species relying on these islands, I not yet. I think these are more probably long-term impacts, which I haven't seen. But I can venture a guess that definitely turtles are going to be more restricted either than in protected areas or are going to move to more areas in the floodplains where again then there'll be more chances of human wildlife conflict. And if nesting grounds kind of are disappearing or nesting areas are constantly getting inundated before hatchlings can come out, we're going to see sudden drops in populations, especially for turtles that kind of have a very slow life where their reproductive age is comes much later, and they depend on laying many multiple clutches with a lot of eggs. So if those nests are destroyed, then yeah, it's going to be a problem.
Oh,
Um,
Urvashi has a second part of the
Second question.
that
So
I'll just read
it
it out for those who will watch this later.
yes,
Sorry, that
yeah.
he's asking, are these sand mines a location of human wildlife conflict?
So it's a little contentious to answer this. The sand island photo that I showed you with the houses on it, that was exactly in the middle of Orang National Park. As of 2023, last year, they've all been, you know, demolished, and they've been moved out from there. They've been removed from there. And there have always been accusations from forest department or bureaucracy that these people poach, these people hunt. Um, so I wouldn't want to talk too much, because there is some level of subsistent hunting and fishing that happens, but other than that, the poaching, I wouldn't want to comment on. And of course, then these people are also face the brunt of wild boars coming in and eating their crops, elephants coming and destroying their crops, tigers have attacked people, rhinos have attacked people. So definitely all these sand islands, especially if they're near protected areas, they are in close proximity to wildlife. So there's conflict happening from the wildlife end, but then there's also conflict from the human end as well, that which we can't ignore.
Right, right. Thanks. And the next question is from Rahul Das, who's asking, what role do turtles play in this ecosystem? Can we try and introduce rare turtles?
Yeah. So turtles are extremely important in freshwater systems. They're kind of like apex predators and scavengers. So different turtle species have different diets, but a lot of herbivores or omnivorous turtles, for example, will eat a lot of moss, algae, snails, water hyacinth. Softshell turtles kind of will weed out all of the weak fish. They scavenge on dead, dying animals. So they kind of are cleaners of the river, and they really make the river very healthy and free flowing, and a lot of leaf litter, etc. The enormous volumes of leaf litter, algae, moss are consumed if hardshell turtles are present in good populations. Regarding reintroduction, definitely it's a great idea. If populations are dropping, there are a lot of captive breeding programs. But if you're releasing turtles into a habitat, but you're not mitigating the threats that are facing them once they grow bigger or once they're released, if they're again going to get caught in a fisherman's net, they don't have place to bask, they don't have a sand island to nest, you're kind of not going to see any net changes in the population as a result of the reintroduction programs. So conservation programs again need to be very well thought out with a monitoring program after reintroduction, and kind of make sure that you're mitigating these threats.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it speaks so much about accountability of all these actions that we're taking. Yeah. So Kabita is congratulating you for your work, and then asks, can
Okay.
you also reflect a little bit more on how indigenous knowledge can be incorporated to conservation?
Yeah. So that's something that I'm really trying to do in one of my questions in my PhD, where different local communities we're seeing already have ways of adapting to the floods and adapting to this floodplain system. A lot of people also are very well aware of, fishing cycles, fish abundances, fish spawning season, turtle nesting seasons. So all of this is immense traditional knowledge, ecological knowledge that people have. And we're seeing a change now in India where a lot of it is being incorporated into conservation strategies. The knowledge systems of these people is being considered as valid, is being used to complement other science and ecological findings that people have. But specifically related to floods, I think it's really important that we already utilize the knowledge that people have, because people who have a longer connection to the place to the river and are river dependent, especially river tribes like the missing community, have been dealing with this for centuries and have adapted their entire lifestyle to dealing with the floods. So if there are certain communities that are newer to the landscape, or migrant communities that have moved there because land was cheap or it was available to them, these kind of findings or these kind of cultural lifestyles can be shared or can be broached so that people are able to mitigate or adapt to the floods and live better lives. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. Ashutosh says, great talk, Anuja. And he asks, our understanding of protected areas is more often than not, in quotes, very forest or terrestrial based housing charismatic animals. So, how differently do you imagine protected areas on rivers?
Yeah. Uh, I don't really have an answer for it. I can just tell you that what exists is not great and it's not helping. So like in Ganga, or the graphs I showed you of the Varanasi turtle sanctuary, just a 7 kilometer stretch is conserved, and then forest department is releasing turtles. They're moving upstream, they're moving downstream. You can't have linear boundaries on a free flowing river system. So ideally, an entire circumference or area and the entire floodplain also kind of needs to be looked at. And the forest department and communities living in those areas need to be aware that you live in a riverine floodplain protected area. And then these are, the ways you can help protect wildlife, be more mindful if there are conflict situations. Same way as you have buffer areas of national parks or forest wildlife sanctuaries. In the same way, we need to look into the entire floodplain and think of larger riverine stretches and floodplain areas that need to be protected. You can't just have 2 kilometers or 7 kilometers of protected areas.
Right. Thank you for that. I think that's an evolving understanding also beyond the terrestrial that we see now. Parag Saikia says, thank you for your amazing work, Anuja. Would love to know more about your work. And he asks, I'm interested to know, how does dam construction affect turtle habitat?
Yeah, so I didn't take a screenshot of the map that I had, but I did a very short study in Narora in Uttar Pradesh, where there's a barrage because there's an atomic power plant. So they have a barrage and there's a channel of water that goes for the power plant, and that's a very turtle dense area. The western part of UP and Ganga is incredible for turtle diversity, and turtle numbers is really huge. So we looked at the bathymetric, the river depth, and obviously the river depth drastically drops after the dam, after the barrage. And that again then impacts how the sand islands and sand bars are formed downstream, and the quality as well, like the riparian vegetation, the quality of the nesting grounds is not, the basking grounds is not great downstream of the dam. And we definitely saw a huge drop in turtle numbers, and especially those 2 or 3 turtle species that are more sensitive, we didn't find them downstream of the barrage as well. So I can more or less say that definitely dam construction negatively affects turtle habitats and also their abundances and the available diversity of certain turtle species as well.
Yeah, I think we've seen this enough number of times in terms of even water releases downstream of dams, and
Yeah.
Gharyal Sanctuary, I think, is one of the prime examples of
Yeah.
criminal, stopping
Yeah.
of the flows. There's no e-flow.
Flow of water.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
Ashutosh
I
has
agree.
yeah, Ashutosh has a couple of other questions also. I'm encouraging others to ask a question if you have. We just have time for like maybe 2 questions. So
Yeah.
for Ashutosh's first question, he asks, how does destruction of sand islands or unavailability of sand affect the dietary needs of turtles? Can you talk a little about the diet of freshwater turtles?
So I don't think they would directly affect the diet because most turtles are omnivores or scavengers and carnivores. So like soft shell turtles primarily are feeding on fish in the water. They do kind of also maybe like gharials or magas also surface to kind of eat the fish, but it isn't really dependent on land or a sandbar kind of being nearby. And a lot of the roof turtles or the hardshell turtles are also eating aquatic snails or leaf litter, aquatic vegetation, moss in the water itself. So, and maybe there might be chance occurrences of turtles eating vegetation or grasses on a sand island, but it's highly doubtful. But you do have other semi-aquatic turtles, like or in the forests of Western Ghats that like eat mushrooms and things like that on land. But in general, if we're talking about river or aquatic turtles, I don't think the sand islands really affects them. But again, if the fish spawning grounds, all of that gets affected, and then you affect the fish populations, then that will affect the turtles diet. Yeah.
Right, right. Thank you. I've always thought that there's some kind of vegetation also involved, but clearly there's much to learn. There's one question from Rahul, which I think I want to ask, which is how are
Yeah.
indigenous people affecting turtle conservation, as you mentioned?
So in India specifically, there are a lot of instances of like communities that they know which are the common turtles in their areas, or that turtles are found in their, backyard ponds, not just in Assam, but also in uh, parts of Tamil Nadu and Goa as well as. So a lot of people know, okay, now monsoon season also turtle hatchlings will be there. So they are very mindful of, picking up a turtle, releasing them in a lake, pond. Local peoples that come across turtles quite a lot. Also in India, uh, turtles do have a very strong religious significance. So in a lot of temple ponds, we do see a huge turtle presence. In Assam, it's huge, but also in a lot of parts of UP. Any temple you go to that has a big enough pond, you'll definitely see turtles there that are either released by people into it as a ritual or as a blessing or offering. So, in a way, you could consider these community bonds or these temple bonds as like ex situ, reassurance colonies or of certain turtles, like the black softshell turtle is quite rare in the wild. It's critically endangered now, but there's huge populations of them in like 13, 14 temple ponds across Assam and Northeast India. So, in a way, you could say that they're assurance colonies because of people's faith and the cultural religious significance, but then the conditions in those ponds aren't great, and they're not fulfilling, they don't have all of their ecological and feeding and dietary requirements, so they're living cramped captive existences. Um, but now also in Assam, we're trying to work, especially in the north bank of Kaziranga, where there are a lot of turtle species and they keep coming into people's backyards. We're trying to get people to, keep a record of what species they're seeing and where they're releasing it, and just start mapping it out. So we have a better idea from people itself, and all of this is kind of, we're generating data from what people are already doing.
Yeah, yeah. Do you want to tell people about the turtle, temple turtle series and
Yeah. So on our Instagram page, you can follow us at FTTF India. We have a lot of social media awareness posts about turtles, and right now we're doing a series on temple turtles, where we're encouraging people to, if you've ever seen a turtle in a temple pond or in a community pond and have a picture, please share it. You can email, I'll put my email and the Instagram in the chat. Email or DM us with the picture and, a story of what you felt when you saw the turtle, or how it made you feel, or what are your thoughts on what can be done, because we want to kind of get a broader understanding of the significance turtles have to people, especially culturally and religiously. And we're hoping that people who maybe think that, oh, turtles deserve to be in temple ponds, or that what's the harm in, releasing a turtle into a temple pond, maybe read other people's experiences and then somehow feel a change in behavior or change in themselves by reading other people's experiences. So we're trying to share that on Instagram. So if you have a story, please feel free to send that in to us.
yeah, yeah. We're putting the email and the Instagram link on the chat here. But if you're watching this later on YouTube, we'll also put these details in the description. So you can always email the folks with these details. Yeah. Before we sort of wrap this up, I want to quickly share the poster for the next session. This is going to happen with Avli on 6th of July, Saturday from 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. Please register for it. If you are here now and you want to attend the next session, just say yes in the chat and we'll register you for it. But we'll also send you a follow-up email with these details. Yeah, you can just send a yes right now and we'll take care of your registration. But thank you so much, Anuja, for
Thank you.
lovely session. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I learned so much today, and I'm I'm hoping to continue learning from the things that you are seeing as part of your PhD work and part of your field work that you're doing in Assam. So yeah, incredible. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, thank you everyone for all of your feedback and your questions. Really, I enjoy talking about this. This is me at my happiest talking about rivers and turtles. So I really appreciate Sid for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, and it's not just me. I forgot to mention in the beginning, my teammates Ria and Ashani are all
Mhm.
here. They've been handling everything at the back end while I've been talking. So shout out to both of them, and
Yeah,
thank you everyone for joining today. Uh, Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, wherever you are. We'll send you a follow-up email right now with all the links.
yeah,
And
yeah.
yeah, thank you. I'll just stop the recording now.